Hello, everyone. Um, I'm Olga Mayorova, Director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and I'm glad to resume our Chris Noon lectures. Before introducing our speaker for today, I would like to announce some exciting upcoming events. During the first week of October, the WISA Center for Emerging Democracies, Greece, Slavic, and other U of M units are hosting Viktor Yushchenko, President of Ukraine from 2005-2010. He will give a public lecture on Thursday, October the 3rd, entitled Shades of Orange, a Decade of Ukrainian Democracy. To coincide with his visit, there will be 3 Ukrainian exhibits. On Tuesday, October the 8th, the Frankel Center and Greece will co-sponsor a lecture by Henrik Baron, a professor of languages, literatures, and cultures at SUNY Albany. His topic will be researching the protocols of the elders of Zion. Do we know the Russian author of the forgery? On Wednesday, October the 9th, at this time, students who received funding from Greece and other WISA Center units will present on their internship and research. Finally, our next Greece Noon lecture will be in 2 weeks on October 16th. The presenter will be Mary Gluck, Professor of History and Comparative Literature at Brown University. She will be talking about Budapest commercial entertainment at the turn of the 20th century. For complete information on these events, see the materials on the table near the door, please. And now I'm excited to introduce our today's speaker, Kirill Kalinin. Kirill is a doctorate candidate in the Department of Political Science at the University of Michigan and a student in the program in survey methodology at the Institute for Social Research. Before enrolling at U of M in 2008, he was a Fulbright and Carnegie visiting scholar at ISR's Center for Political Studies. Kirill conducted very extensive field work in Russia in 2012. While conducting his research, he was a visiting instructor at the Economic School in Moscow and European University at St. Petersburg. His major research interests are election forensic analysis and political methodology. Please join me in welcoming Kirill to Chris Noon Lectures series.
I'm delighted to be here, and I'm thankful to the Greece and to the WISA Center for inviting me here and being actually so generous in their help and support over the years. I'm especially thankful to Olga for her invitation. The talk I'm about to present will be focused on the study of relationship between election frauds and election ratings in Russia for the presidential elections 2012. I'll be also referring to the most recent mayoral elections in Moscow, linking my previous research with the current events. For me personally, this is a highly important and interesting topic to talk about, since it helps to better understand the theoretical mechanism described in the work of Timur Kuran and on preference falsification with the emphasis on frauds. Also, this research within the election forensics literature, this research is new from the perspective that it actually aims to combine together the data from the from the surveys, from the polling agencies, with the electoral statistics, with the data provided by the Russian government. So what is my research about? In my research, I'm mostly interested in whether election fraud can be in any way related to the preference falsification. By preference falsification, so I will be dwelling on more what preference falsification is about. So, but for now, this is inclination of respondents to misreport their electoral choice. However, here I avoid discussion of micro-foundations of preference falsification. The reason why preference falsification in Russia actually takes place, why respondents actually are inclined to misreport to the pollsters, to the survey organizations, their true electoral choices. Moreover, the major challenge of this research is that the measurement of preference falsification and the measurement of election fraud is quite difficult to implement, because both of these processes are latent. They are not really easily measurable. So the outline of the presentation is as follows. First, I will talk a bit about the context, electoral context of 2012 elections. Then I will be giving you a general mechanism of election fraud in Russia. Some theoretical body of literature will be discussed. Then I will be sharing with you empirical findings, implications, and future directions of this research. Throughout the 2000s, Russian elections have been described by majority of scholars as increasingly unfree and unfair. The most recent Russian presidential elections in 2012 were marked by the spread of massive protests associated with the growing public awareness of electoral manipulations and allegations of election fraud. Indeed, Russia is characterized by a mixture of legal and illegal practices, institutional barriers, unequal media coverage, improper campaigning practices, voter coercion, ballot box tampering, stuffing, protocol tampering, etc. Surprisingly, however, in spite of this abundance of this evidence about the election frauds, about electoral violations in Russia, many electoral forecasts, majority of electoral forecasts released by major national polling organizations always closely matched official results with Putin's overwhelming lead in the ratings. How this kind of observation is possible? On the one hand, we observe election frauds. On the other hand, Putin's ratings seem to match the official results pretty well. So the question is, could there be some hidden source of inflations in those ratings? So let us have a closer look at the election ratings. Putin's, these are approval ratings. So throughout his presidency and premiership, Vladimir Putin maintained consistently high approval ratings from the Russian public. However, in 2011-2012 electoral cycle, as we see from the graph, Putin's approval ratings by then, deteriorated, compared to the previous, years quite much. And on the other hand, what we can't see from this graph, but we can guess. So the drop in Putin's approval ratings is also accompanied by the growth of anti-regime sentiments. In spite of the observed decline in Putin's ratings, as measured by major polling organizations, which can be, by the way, partly explained by the changes in economic perceptions. For instance, Stresemann, in his most recent article, argues that this is because of the economic perception. These contradicted expectations of many observers that actually the decline of Putin's approval ratings was much severe. So here I offer the mechanism, the general mechanism based on Curran's formal model of preference falsification. Basically, preference falsification, the inclination of respondents to misreport their true preferences, political preferences, creates a leeway for numerous electoral violations by seeping into election forecasts. First, preference falsification seeps into the surveys. Preference falsification seeps into the surveys, and it inflates election ratings. Then election fraud actually occurs. To compensate for the preference falsification. Finally, inflated electoral outcomes result in post-electoral preference falsification, which I'm not going to discuss here. So my basically today's presentation will be built around these three parts. So first, I will be talking about social desirability bias. Is there actually social desirability bias, and how we can measure for the Russian presidential elections 2012. On the second on the second stage, I will be discussing if actually inflated ratings due to social desirability bias are in any way connected with election fraud in Russia. So, how much time do I have, by the way? I have.
By one.
I need to be okay. Thank you.
You can end earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because I have lots of. I have lots of information actually to tell you. Therefore, I just want to make sure that I don't, overabuse time. So, okay. The general research hypothesis, which is derived from the Curran's model, is that social desirability creates a leeway for numerous electoral violations by seeping into election forecasts. Here it is important to provide definitions for two main concepts which I will be using in my talk interchangeably. The first one is social desirability. So social desirability reflects the inclination of respondents to present themselves in a positive light, thus complying to broad social expectations, shared social norms and values. And the second concept, which is a synonym, basically, it will be used the same way as social desirability bias. So I mean basically the same thing behind this concept. But this is the act of misrepresenting one genuine one's under perceived social pressures. So this term was introduced by Curran. In other words, when an individual feels unsafe about expressing her ideas, contrary to official policy and having some fear of isolation, for instance, if we take Neumann's work, she will be inclined to falsify her political preferences. As a result, preference falsification, private preferences, the genuine preferences of the individuals would be no longer matching the public preferences. In fact, authoritarian regimes are always concerned about preference falsification and try to keep themselves informed about the private preferences of their constituencies by withholding and manipulating with certain parts of the data polls, thus contributing to the rise of the spiral of silence. Okay, so let me just refer you to a broad literature in the field of social desirability, which is usually social desirability studied in the survey methodology literature. And so the questions where social desirability is studied are related to any kinds of socially sensitive issues like drug addiction, sexual behavior, crime, for instance. In political science, we're interested also in some sort of sensitive behaviors, including, for instance, racism, terrorism, corruption, voting in autocracies, the question which I am interested, electoral preference of the individual in the autocracies. In political science, for instance, in his most recent work, Holbrook studied social desirability from the perspective of inflation of turnout. So people are more inclined, let's say, in the telephone surveys to lie about their participations in American elections, right? And the web surveys, for instance, they provide better estimates. So less people lie about their intention or their voting habits. And basing on this, Holbrook actually concludes that, for instance, web surveys would be more efficient in controlling for the social desirability bias compared to the telephone surveys. This is because of the self-administration component. So the person who fills out the form in the web survey, he's sort of sits at home and he is not really affected by anyone, by the interviewer, for instance. So, and there are lots of other actual works I'm not going to talk about, which describe in particular ways, how social desirability can bias responses of the individuals. So my research, what is new about my research is that until now, no studies on social desirability bias have been conducted to address the issue of inflated electoral ratings in the authoritarian context. So this is new to the field, and I hope that it would be developed in the future research. So in order to measure social desirability bias, there are lots of techniques used. I use one of the techniques which is most popular these days and is becoming more and more popular. This is the list experiment, the ICT technique, item count technique, which implies a random assignment of respondents to treatment and control groups. So what it means that each group receives a list with, in my case, 4 basic statements, and in addition to this, the treatment group also receives an additional statement of a sensitive nature. And at the end, so all respondents are asked to provide an estimate of the number of statements they agree with. If you don't understand now yet about the technique, so I will hopefully provide you in the next slide much more detailed information. So this is how it looked for the list experiment in 2012. So basically, we divide the sample of respondents, about 1,200, 300 respondents, into 2 halves. And the first half actually gets this question, The second part gets this question, okay? The first half of the respondents has this treatment item in their question, which sort of they respond to by providing the total number of assertions they agree with. So they don't really say that I agree with this question, with this assertion, with this. They just provide the general number of assertions they agree with. And so if you have any questions about this technique, we can talk about it later, or just ask me, okay, if there is some misunderstanding. So this is the question regarding turnout. So the first question was regarding Putin's support. I voted for Vladimir Putin in the most recent presidential election. So this is the sensitive item, okay? The second one is I voted in the most recent presidential elections. So this is the turnout question, which was also used as an experiment. So there were two experiments, performed. At the end of the day, what we actually derive, we collect all the data, right? And we need to compute the basic, estimate, the proportion of those for who positively answered to the sensitive item, for whom sensitive item actually holds true. So this is a simple mean difference. So this is a very fancy formula, perhaps it's looking from the distance, but it's not that fancy actually. So it's just the difference in means between the treatment and the control group. So by finding the difference of means between two subsamples, right, we are able to derive the estimate, derive the proportion of those individuals who positively said that yes, they are going to vote for Putin, or proportion of those individuals who said that yes, they are going actually to turn out, they're going to visit elections, okay? So the positive side of this estimator, just difference in means estimator, is that it is quite simple actually to perform. But the bad side of it is that basic assumptions for the list experiments can be violated. Basic assumptions can be violated. So now I would be getting a bit into the methodological, technical details of the list experiment. So just, to make sure that we are on the same page. But I'm not going to talk about this part, I think, in full detail, only if you have a specific interest. So the first assumption is randomization of the treatment. So it is expected that the individuals, participating in the surveys were randomly selected into the treatment or control group. So this is done basically to balance out the differences, any kind of differences, explicit or implicit differences between the groups. This is a bit methodological. Assumption 2, no design effect. So no design effect means that the presence of the sensitive item in the list doesn't affect the way responding thinks about control item. This was the most challenging part for me in Russia, because I would say Russian survey organizations, they were very skeptical that would work. For instance, if the individual is asked, if the individual gets into this treatment condition, he can be answering non-sensitive items, or let's say the treatment condition can differently affect the non-sensitive, how he actually answers or relates to non-sensitive items than in this condition. So, it might affect, it might pollute the way individual if he sees Putin, then he just thinks, oh my gosh, it's always 0, or it's always 5, or always 4. It's just, it can be very effective. It can be very detrimental to the technique. So it can really pollute the results. Basically, I couldn't reject the null of no design effect in the data for both of the experiments. So this is what I have. So the result is not really optimistic, but at the same time, so this is what I have. And the third assumption is that there are no liars in the experiment. What it means that there are not too many positive numbers or too many negative numbers. So it means that, for instance, if the person would agree to all of the statements here, he would basically reveal his preference at the end of the day, right? If he says, I agree with 5 assertions, right, then you know that actually the individual would be voting for Putin. And if he says that he agrees with none of the assertions, then sort of by the end of the day that the individual won't be supportive of Putin, right? So this is something which can affect, at the end of the day, can affect the technique. If there are too many answers like this, so this can be really detrimental, really dangerous. Okay. So the data. Pre-election polls analyzed here were conducted by Levada Center. The 2 surveys were conducted collected in 2012, in February 2012. Levada Center surveys are based on, for whom it is important, on proportional stratified sampling procedure, with a selection of households completed by random root method, and the selection of the respondents by the birthday method. So this is like almost a probability sample. The sample size is about 1,500 to 1,600 respondents, and so 2 pre-election polls combined would give us roughly the estimate of 3,000 respondents. I resorted to, as you see, to partial pooling of my data, merging, 2 data sets together, and this kind of merging was actually justified by the statistical test I performed. If you would love to know more about this test, I would be more than happy to provide you this information. What are the results of the analysis? So this is finally where we, the most interesting part finally starts. So in the graph, the estimates derived from the mean difference estimator illustrate 2 main findings. First, there is no statistically significant difference between the official results. So these are official results. The blue line symbolizes official result for Putin, and the red line for turnout, in the 60s. So as we see from the graph, there is no any statistical difference between the direct self-report, direct question, if the individual answers the question directly, right? And official results. So this is one finding. Another finding, there is actually a statistically significant difference between the direct self-report, so the if the respondent answers the question directly, the direct question on whether he's going to vote for Putin or going to participate, versus ICT technique. So ICT technique, the least experimental technique, which controls for the social desirability bias, actually gives us estimates which are significantly lower than the estimates provided by the direct self-report. And this is really a striking finding. I would say it is quite consistent with other research which was also done during 2012. So it's pretty convincing. And to make a better sense of this information, here I also provide a table to give you just estimates of what was portrayed in the graph. As we see, the indirect questioning techniques yields both voting and turnout estimates that are significantly lower than the direct self-report estimate. So here what we see that among all of the participants, right, incumbents of Putin would be receiving 47% of votes. If measured by the ICT technique. If measured by the direct question, he would be getting 66% of the votes, right? This is what actually Levada Center, it was official forecast of Levada Center closest to the election in 2012, 66%. But by ICT technique, you get a bit different result. Same with turnout. So the turnout seems to be 51%, the real turnout as measured with the list experiment with controlling for social desirability bias, compared to the turnout measured by the direct self-report, by the direct questioning technique, which is 67. Okay. And all these numbers, all these proportions are significantly different. So why I stress on this? Because it really makes sense, and the differences are really can be explained by randomization or by sampling. There is something else going on besides this, and hopefully the theory which I'm talking about would be showing you that it can be a reliable, it can provide us with a reliable explanation of what is going on. Okay, the question which has still a strong interest to us is who is most likely to misreport his or her position. To better evaluate the magnitude of effects and make them readily interpretable, I computed the quantities of interest in terms of predicted probabilities for direct and indirect electoral support for both electoral support of Putin and turnout across different socio-demographic groups. And what you actually see from the graph, from the first graph, which shows the effects of demographic variables on voting for Putin. First, that for instance, the respondents, if we look here, the younger respondents are more inclined to say they support Putin than they actually reveal. Respondents which are older are more inclined to say that they do not support Putin than they actually show. There is no statistically significant difference between the attitude towards voting for Putin between male and female groups of the respondents. Poor, for instance, the poor group, right? It is more supportive of Putin. It is in reality more supportive of Putin than it actually reveals. Rich people are less supportive of Putin than they actually reveal with the direct question. So the same kind of idea is hidden in this graph. So I will just try to speed up a bit to not to dwell on too much on these graphs. So the basic idea is that the result we get from the direct self-report, from the direct questioning technique, and indirect questioning technique is described by different, kinds of social demographic profiles. Actually, people are lying, and different groups lie differently about whether they support Putin or whether they're going to, or whether they have participated in the elections or not. So this is the very interesting finding. So here in the next slide, I actually provide you with the different ways to compute social desirability. So on the left, you see the different means estimator, which I showed you previously. And on the right, I also computed the corrected estimate from the model, controlling for the no liars assumption. So as you see, so the corrected estimate actually gives us a pretty close estimate of real electoral support for Putin, compared to the difference in means estimator. But for turnout, this is not the case. So the corrected estimate for turnout is 66%, which is close to the official turnout. So why there is a difference in two different estimates? Perhaps turnout is more affected by some sort of biases, by some kind of errors in the technique. Okay, so that might be the explanation. Okay, so in the remaining time, I would just so in the second part. Okay, this is a social desirability thing, social desirability part, and now will be talking about measuring election fraud in Russia, and then I won't be going into much detail, just to give you a general impression of what is going on. So election fraud, as we know from studying Russia during the 2000s, is a widely spread phenomenon in Russian elections. So it is usually analyzed using different election forensics methods. And analysis of electoral data is usually designed to detect certain anomalies in this data. So we use the abundance of technique within the field of election forensics, helping us to detect the anomalies in the electoral data. So I won't be talking much about it, but these are different techniques, building densities, digit tests, regression analysis. Everything can be used. Well, not everything, of course, but there are techniques over there which help us to more or less credibly assess the presence of anomalies, hopefully attributed to election fraud. And these are some density plots, just to show you about what has been going on in Russia in the 2000s. On the left, these are the density plots, for instance, for parliamentary elections. So these are the density plots which actually portray the distribution of the vote shares for each of the parties. Okay, and then on the right is the same kind of idea, but only for presidential elections. And on average, you would assume that the distribution would be normal, but it's not really normal. So the normality means Gaussian actually curve, right? So it's best described by the Gaussian curve, normality curve. And data doesn't look really nice. So the data doesn't look really normal. Moreover, it looks very spiky, and the rounded, percentages of vote shares for Putin, for instance. And spikiness, it looks very artificial to us. So this is what, adds more suspicion about Russian elections. In the graphs below, you see there is a positive correlation between the turnout and vote shares for Putin and for United Russia. For United Russia here and for turnout over there. Well, there is still this positive correlation, which is not really well explained. Like on average, you would assume that there is no any correlation between turnout and party share or Putin's share or vote share. So what we actually what I actually suggest to use as a measure of election fraud here is a last digit approach. So the observed graphs which I showed you are characterized by these spike distributions, which result of an adjustment, which result from an adjustment of turnout and vote counts to specific rounded figures. So in fact, analysis of the last digit of turnout counts shows that there are always too many zeros, with one exception, too few nines, and usually too many fives. So this is a kind of a rounding effect, which, according to our theory, which we developed together with Walter, who is here, according to our theory, this kind of rounding effect can be explained actually by the signaling taking place when the governor actually to signals the center about his or her loyalty actually rounds these numbers in order to meet some kind of plan made up somewhere in the Kremlin. So this is like the general theory behind this kind of phenomenon. And it is well developed in our paper, so if you have an interest to read more about signaling games in Russia and election forensics, tied to the signaling game, you are more than welcome to read our paper. So, and this is exactly, so why I'm talking about signaling, this is because I will be using, on the one hand, I will be using the social desirability variable measure. On the other hand, I will be using the signaling measure, okay, which actually gives us information about, sort of portrays, represents information of the election fraud in a given region. So, and here I'm just showing you geographical location of pre-election surveys in Russia. I have divided data into the regions. So, and I have been basically this part of the analysis is presents kind of cross-regional analysis, and it includes 44 regions of Russia. The average number of cases per each region is about 60-70. Okay, so this is not good, but this is the best I have from all this data. It's the best what I can do from the data. And the key measures, are preference falsification or social desirability, whatever label you like. So a measure of preference falsification consists of two measures, two indicators. The first one indicates the share of voters willing to cast their ballots for Putin, openly willing to cast their ballots for Putin. This is the share of respondents derived from the direct questioning technique. And the second is the share of genuine preferences with a measure of social desirability bias obtained from the list experiment. You see? So this is the regional variable. The next measure is a measure of election fraud, and this is the last digit mean of vote counts and number of, or the number of ballots for turnout. So the hypothesis is that the smaller is the last digit mean, the larger is the likelihood of fraud occurrence. And again, this measure of election fraud, why I'm using it? I am using it because I heavily rely on the signaling, theory we developed earlier. So a bit of summary statistics. We generally expect that more election frauds and more preference falsification would be detected in the Russian in the republics, in the Russian republics, due to greater authoritarian tendencies in those regions. Republics seem to be characterized by, indeed, if we compare oblasts, the Russian regions with republics, indeed, republics seem to be characterized by high degree of preference falsification. And we would expect that republics also would be having mean which would be relatively smaller to oblasts, right? Because there would be, the smaller is the mean, the more fraud, the more election fraud you would be getting in the republic. So this is the hypothesis. So anyway, so my basic expectations are really well fitted to voting, but for turnout the picture is a bit different. So republics somehow show that they are better, so there is less preference falsification in republics compared to oblasts, although the measures of election fraud is still nicely matches my theory. So what I do on the next stage, I basically conduct a non-parametric regression analysis between the measure of preference falsification and the measure of election fraud. The reference model has been specified as no effects model, which basically helps me to make sure that the data was not produced by some random processes. Since the sample size of my regression analysis is small, therefore none of the outliers were actually excluded. Okay, so let us jump to the findings. Okay, so what do you see in this graph? So on the x-axis, we see the measure of preference falsification. Okay, on the y-axis, incumbents' level of electoral support. On the left, graph, the effect of preference falsification on electoral support seems to be significant and positive. So this is the test of significance. So for those of you who are interested, this is significant and positive relationship between two measures. This is what we actually expect, this graph to show us. The more there is preference falsification, the more there is electoral support for Putin. Moreover, in order to make better sense of this graph, we need to look at the extremes at certain regions which are on the extremes of the regression line. For instance, on the left, we see the regions with least preference falsification and with the least electoral support, right? We find Primorsky Krai, Omskaya Oblast, Kaliningradskaya Oblast, Moskovskaya Oblast. So the regions which are more or less, those of you who know, Russian literature on Russian politics, so sort of can agree with me that these regions would be would be expected by us to be like on this part of the regression line, okay, on this location. On the right, we see Tatarstan, Kemerovskaya Oblast, Saratovskaya, so those regions which are characterized by, stronger political machines in the regions. Well, for turnout, the relationship is more nonlinear. So if we look at the second graph on the right, we will see that for turnout, the relationship is more nonlinear, but the effect is significant. On the left, the smallest level of preference falsification is unexpectedly actually for Dagestan, which, it's really, I think something is going on with the survey there. Something is went wrong. Maybe they falsified the survey. I don't know. Chuvashskaya Republic. On the right from the regression line, we can see Bashkortostan, Lipetskaya, Nizhegorодskaya Oblast, Adygea. So these regions are characterized by most preference falsification and with the least, turnout. Finally, preference falsification versus anomaly. So the graph on the left displays the relationship between the preference falsification and election fraud. Although the effect is fully supported by the theory, we see there is a negative slope. This is what we would expect. The greater is the preference falsification in the region, the more likely that there will be election fraud, right? So this is exactly the direction of the line you would expect. And for turnout, the relationship is more nonlinear. So it's very hard to, although the effect is statistically significant, it's pretty hard to say, what is going on with the turnout. So the main research objective of this study was to provide a theoretical framework linking together preference falsification and election fraud in the formal model introduced by Kuran. I attempted to test if the model can be supported by empirical data collected during the Russian presidential campaign. So empirical analysis shows that the effect of preference falsification does indeed influence Putin's vote share and the measure of turnout. The effect of preference falsification on Putin's support, as well as the magnitude of electoral anomalies, is largely linear, positive, and statistically significant. However, the effect of preference falsification on turnout is negative and nonlinear. The effect of preference falsification on electoral anomalies is significant but characterized by a high degree of nonlinearity. Now, what I wanted at the end to dwell on a bit about Moscow mayoral elections 2013. So the Moscow mayoral election was held on September 8, 2013, and elections marked the first time in 10 years when the citizens of Moscow could choose their mayor for a popular vote. What made these elections especially intriguing is participation of the two contenders, two candidates, Sergei Sobyanin, a Kremlin-backed candidate, and Alexei Navalny, the leader of Russian opposition. Elections turned out to be very surprising in two different respects. The first surprise is none of the pollsters was able to accurately predict. By accurately, I mean within the margin of survey error, the results of the outcome. As you see here, these are, three major polling organizations which have been reporting their forecast, electoral forecast, over the electoral campaign. But the most recent, the closest estimates of the closest estimates for each of the candidates doesn't real the closest estimates to the date of the elections don't really match the official results well. You see, Comcon, for instance, predicted that Sobyanin would be getting 60% of the vote, but official result is, is 51-4. Same with Levada Center, 4. Like on average, and if you look at the Navalny, the error, goes the other direction. So all these three organizations underestimated actually Navalny, his electoral support. And on average, every survey organization was off by at least 8 percentage points. Sobyanin wrongly gained 8 points, Navalny wrongly lost 8 points. So, and this is really surprising because electoral polls turned out to be ineffective and in the unexpectedly clean, actually, electoral setting. If you look at the electoral data, at Sergei Shpilkin's analysis presented here, you see, do you remember the graphs I showed you for the Russian presidential and parliamentary elections, the density plots? These are the same density plots, but they look very normal. They look very normal. The second graph shows us the correlation between Sobyanin's vote share and turnout, and there is no any correlation. So there is no any direction of the or any kind of skewity in the graph. So no kind of correlation between those two measures. So at least regarding if we take assumptions of the electoral statistics and we treat these results seriously, and if we also add to these the accounts of electoral observers, then we would conclude that mayoral elections were clean, and if there was some kind of fraud component to them, it wasn't really spotted by statistical analysis, or by the accounts of the observers. So the elections were good, but somehow all of the survey organizations couldn't predict the outcomes of the good elections. So what kind of conclusion we can draw from these revelations, from this surprise? So my major explanation is that this fact can be, one of the major explanations can be the persistence of the social desirability bias. Survey organizations didn't account for this fact. Moreover, given the clean elections, when the official results were not inflated by election frauds, we ended up in observing this discrepancy and being surprised by this discrepancy. But this is not something to be really surprised about. The presence of social desirability was in 2012, and it was in these elections. Moreover, I would tell you, like a week before the elections, I was asked by the news portal Politru to write about the quality of the ratings. And what I did, I wrote an article about, clean elections and about survey organizations. Basically stating that survey organizations, in order to improve their techniques, in order to fight with for instance, social desirability bias, they need clean elections. And this is what actually eventually happened. They got clean elections, and they learned from these clean elections that actually they are not able to predict, the results. Okay. And implications. Well, the derived findings indicate that polling organizations can impact the quality of elections in authoritarian regimes by applying techniques that enable them to control for the presence of social desirability bias. Surveys become important providers of politically sensitive information, facing the growing risks of state control. So therefore, they are quite vulnerable. For instance, the anti-NGOs campaign, which was launched in spring 2012 in Russia, also affected the Levada Center, or positioning itself as an independent survey organization. Besides, this research opens broad discussion of the issues related to the quality of survey research in authoritarian regimes and its relationship to election fraud, and possibility of cross-national research with respect to the preference falsification in electoral ratings. So this is all from me, and now I look forward to your questions.